Hello, this is Fort Necessity, and the date is July 3rd, 1754. This small palisade has been constructed by George Washington to house his magazine, Wounded and Dead Soldiers, as they prepare to be attacked by a combination of French soldiers and Native Americans from Fort Duquesne. Just recently, George Washington had participated in a massacre of French soldiers, a massacre at Jumenauven Glen. And the French claimed that Jumenauvel was a diplomat and had been assassinated. In fact, it is probable that Washington's ally, Tenacrison, split open his skull with a hatchet as he was pleading for his life at the feet of George Washington. So Washington had retreated here to a place called Great Meadows, where he erected this small palisades and built earthworks with ditches behind them to place his 400 men to await the attack. He called it Fort Necessity because he was 50 miles away from Willis Creek in Cumberland, Maryland, where he would have support. He knew that he would have to survive here, and he thought that this location, this small fort, would suffice. It would not, and he was very fortunate to get out alive. When the French and the Indians came, they discovered that this fort had been constructed in a meadows, great meadows, in the bottom of a small bowl next to two creeks, small creeks, certainly nothing of a barrier. But more importantly, Washington's soldiers had been unable to clear the forest more than 60 yards out. And so the Native Americans and French soldiers did not need a frontal attack to wear down the defenders. They were out in front of the earthworks in a pool of water because of the rain. There was no room for them inside the stockade, and they were slowly picked off one by one by the Native Americans and the French. It was a horrendous day for George Washington. He lost 100 men dead and wounded, and many more sick. He would drag their bodies inside the stockade while the grumbling defenders would face off with the mysterious hidden fire that was coming at them from all directions in a complete encirclement. It looked pretty bad for these British soldiers, the Virginia militia and George Washington. But at the end of the day, there was a call from a French officer. He wanted to parley. Washington was not going to let that Frenchman into his palisade and see how bad situations really were. So he sent one of his officers out into the meadow to meet with the French. The French indicated that they were willing to give terms, that they came here to avenge the death of Jumenauvel. They did not seek the annihilation of all of his men. Strange as that may be, especially at a time of high tensions and obvious war. But perhaps the French were running out of ammunition. They had come quickly with about 600 French troops and 100 Native Americans up the Monongahela to the creek of Redstone, now Brownsville, Pennsylvania, marched overland past what is now the Uniontown settlement, up over Chestnut Ridge where Jumenauvel was killed, and down into this bowl where they found Washington and his men holed up. Perhaps they didn't bring enough ammunition. Perhaps their Indian scouts indicated that there were, in fact, more British regulars on the march to relieve Washington here. Perhaps They recognized, they being the French, that someone was going to be blamed for starting another war. And they didn't want to be the ones taking the responsibility. They already had Washington allegedly killing one of their diplomatic envoys, Jumonville. So perhaps the French officer decided that he did not want to be blamed for what was going to occur afterwards. Or perhaps he was simply a professional soldier. He was older, more experienced than Washington. Washington in his very early 20s, with virtually no experience. Perhaps he just felt that he needed to do the right thing at a time when he had the upper hand. Who knows? But when he sent in the Articles of Capitulation, they contained two statements which Washington later would deny any knowledge of. And you can see a copy, a reproduction of those now, and you can read the French, and you can see the words, l'assassination, where Washington, by signing the document, indicates that he was personally responsible for the assassination of Jumonville, a diplomat of the French government. Now, it's true, the document was in ink, and it was wet, and it was smudged, and it was true that Washington did not speak French, and that it had to be translated, in this case by a Dutchman who supposedly knew French. But it is difficult to imagine that that translator didn't point out that word showing up on the document 2 times. But what would you have done if you were in that small stockade with your men virtually drowning in ditches behind very small stockades, very small earthworks? Would you have said, as Washington later said, that he never would have signed those Articles of Capitulation had he known that the assassination clause was in the writings? Would you have done that? Or would you have signed that document to save your men and to get them home? Regardless, Washington denied ever knowing that language, and he successfully was able to retreat with his force, his sick and his dying. And he marched out of this stockade in between 2 lines of Frenchmen, and he made it back to Fort Cumberland. These were very early years in George Washington's career. And if there's one thing that we have learned through the Revolution, is that George Washington knew how to retreat. He knew how to win, but he picked those victories carefully. He survived by learning how to retreat. So here we are at Fort Necessity. And we're going to see George Washington back at the burned husk of this fort a year later with General Braddock, as George Washington gets ready to participate in his 3rd disaster here in the Ohio country. Take a look. I'll move the camera. Our nation starts here with George Washington at Fort Necessity, Southwestern, Pennsylvania.